Good morning. Welcome everyone, those of you here and those at home. And can we first of all apologise to those who are watching online for the delay to the start. There were some technical issues which needed to be sorted out. So hopefully we're up and running now. So today we're going to share some thoughts on the bereavement journey together. I'll draw on the work of bereavement experts for this talk, and present information from different sources like Alzheimer's Society, Sue Ryder Foundation, Marie Curie, and some others. So I'd just like to acknowledge those sources of information. Some of you may have attended the talk last November, which was How Does Our Faith Help Us in Bereavement Support? And the focus then was on increasing our understanding of the process of grief in ways that would help us to support others. And if you missed it, I think it is still available, and I'm sure Eileen can give you a link if you don't have it. What I hope for today in this talk is that we can share some thoughts that will help all of us when the time comes that we will grieve the loss of someone we've loved. Grief therapist Julia Samuel has said that she believes grief is very much misunderstood and that we need to understand the process of grief and acknowledge its necessity. I think it's reasonable to say that in our society there's a prevailing tendency to think that everything can and should be fixed, that there is something we can and should do to take away the pain and discomfort, and we would like the result to be almost immediate. But we can't fix grief. It's a natural process, it takes time, and each person will grieve in his or her own way, and it takes as long as it takes. We can't put a time frame to it. We'll look more closely at this as we go on. Perhaps also we think of grief as something that only happens when someone dies, but there are other circumstances that involve the process of grief. And we need to grieve all the different losses in our lives. Maybe a job, a relationship, maybe a breakdown in family relationships. Could be a gradual or sudden loss of our own health and vitality, or a life-changing illness. Father Michael's asked me to spend a little bit of time in today's presentation to look specifically at two situations that cause us to grieve. When someone we love receives a diagnosis of terminal illness or a diagnosis of dementia. So, as we begin to reflect, let's just take a few moments to center ourselves as we prepare to listen and to share. Let's begin by sitting comfortably. If you can sit relaxed but alert. And just notice your breathing as you breathe steadily in and out. Just notice and focus on your breath, steadily breathing in and out. We breathe in the life-giving breath of God. And as we breathe out, we can gently let go of all that's preoccupying us this morning. We choose to be present to this moment just as it is, just as we are. And we ask the Holy Spirit to guide our hearts and minds as we say, "Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, enkindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth." Every one of us will, at some time in our lives, have to set out on that journey through grief. And we will need the love and the care and the support of our families and our close friends as we make this journey that we would rather not have to take. It's a lonely journey, but we don't have to take it alone. We need the love and support of others, our family and our friends. And in this parish, there's now a bereavement ministry. A small team of people have had some training, but perhaps more importantly than that, they have felt called to this ministry of accompanying people who are grieving. And I'll mention a bit more about that later. Grief expert Julia Samuel said recently, "When you're grieving, you may feel like you're drowning in sadness. Sometimes waves of it can seem to come out of nowhere and overwhelm and overburden you. It could be something simple like a sound or a smell or a scene that can make this happen." And she says the last thing you want to do is to dread it in complete helplessness. And so she reminds us that there is a better way, and it starts with understanding your grief. And so our purpose here today is to reflect on loss and bereavement in such a way that we can get a fuller understanding of that journey that all of us will make. As I mentioned in the introduction, we can't fix grief. Irish psychotherapist Liz Gleason explains that it's very difficult to understand grief and all its nuances if we ourselves have not experienced profound loss. If we don't have an understanding of grief, then it's easy to think that grief is a sad feeling that someone experiences when a person they love dies, and that after some time the sadness goes away and we get back to normal. But when she meets people in her therapy practice, they say things like, "I had no idea what grief was really like." And she describes what many people experience as a terrifying range of emotions that have such depth and breadth to them. It can feel like you're overflowing and bursting at the seams. And then people ask her, "How long will this last? When can I get back to normal?" And she describes recently a phone call that she had from a friend who was looking for someone, maybe a grief counsellor, looking for someone to jump in, make sense of it, and put it right. She kindly told her friend that she's so sorry for this loss that had happened in her family, and explained gently that grief is not something that can be fixed, that it's normal, it's an adaptive reaction to loss in our lives. But she says we live in a culture that simply doesn't want to acknowledge that death, grief, and suffering are an integral part of life. She says grief never fully goes away. It's part of our common humanity. When we reflect on John's Gospel, we are told that in the story of Lazarus, we see Jesus in the fullness of his humanity and the fullness of his divinity. And in the fullness of his humanity, Jesus wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. And we too have to allow ourselves to experience the full range of human emotion in whatever way it can present itself in our lives. And finally, Liz Gleason tells us that it's only when we can truly turn towards our pain and allow it to be felt that we can experience some relief. Sister Nora recently gave me a transcript of a retreat which was called Life's Healing Journey. It was given by the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart. And there's a line in it that really caught my attention. It resonated for me. And it's, "There is no healing without feeling and revealing." There is no healing without feeling and revealing. We've shared so many times and will keep on sharing because it's so important to remember. Every person grieves in his or her own way and in his or her own time. It's worth repeating the words of Paula Darcy from her book, Winter of the Heart. To accept and honour someone's pace and manner of grieving is perhaps the greatest love we can express, and it's vital to include ourselves in this acceptance. When we're bereaved, people around us try to be kind and supportive. Those who've suffered profound loss are often the ones who understand best how to reach out. Sometimes there are people who just don't know what to say. And from the kindest of intentions, they can say things that are not all that helpful, and perhaps even unintentionally things that are hurtful. And again, we can turn to Paula Darcy. She says, "We grieve in a way that's consistent with who we are, and we must each find our own way. The reassurances of others may seem hollow. Let it be. Suffering can't be transformed by someone else telling us how to do it or telling us that it will pass." Julia Samuel reminds us that grieving is not only healthy, it's a necessary part of living. She says that we need to slow down, turn inward, embrace our emotions and memories, and grieve fully so that we can accept the new role that's been thrust on us by the loss. Navigating grief doesn't mean that you forget and move on. Instead, You're adjusting to the loss of your previous role, your previous way of life, and starting out on another. She was interviewed recently and she explained how people want to fast track the grieving process, when in fact what they really need to do is to engage with it. And she explains how pain is the agent of change. And after a significant loss, our lives may change considerably, and we need to be able to negotiate and integrate those changes over time. So, on this intensely personal, contradictory, and unpredictable journey through grief, we need to find a way to live with what she calls the central paradox, that we must find a way to live with a reality that we don't want to be true. Whatever is happening, we need to have patience with our own processes. It might help us if we can recognize what's happening to us at various points along the journey. And through it all, as Julia Samuel says, we can find a way to live with the pain of our loss, because that eventually will be what will enable us to heal. And she explains that it's not the pain of grief that can damage us, but the things that we do to avoid the pain. If we try to block the pain, we could also block our capacity to feel the full range of human emotions, including our capacity to experience joy. And so to block the pain and not engage in the process of grief can potentially harm us. To illustrate it, she told the story of her own parents, and each of them had very significant losses before the age of 25. For example, her mother had lost her mother, father, sister, and brother by the time she was 25. And she says they never ever talked about it, because at that time, in the post-war years, people didn't speak about pain and loss, didn't talk about family members they'd lost, because they believed that what you don't talk about can't hurt you. And of course, we know that's not at all true. It was in part, it was observing her parents is what made her, Julia, want to understand more about grief and loss. And consequently, she spent the next 30 years specializing in bereavement. And it was only after I'd done some counseling training and began to gain an understanding of the grieving process that I came to understand the effects of unresolved grief in my own family. And I'll sort of touch on some of that as we go along. So if we're going to set out on the journey of grief, how can we begin to understand grief in ways that help us to accept the loss, process the grief, and start to experience moments of inner peace? To do this, I'd like to share with you the work of Professor Kenneth J. Doka from his book, Grief is a Journey, Finding Your Path Through Grief. And I just want to read you a little bit to tell you who he is. He's a mental health counsellor and a grief expert, professor of gerontology at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle, and he's a senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. He also happens to be an ordained Lutheran minister. So he begins by reminding us that grief is not an illness to get over, but an individual and ongoing journey. He examines some of the common myths about grief and compares those myths to the lived reality of the many people he's accompanied in his work as a grief therapist. So let's take a look at some of those common myths. The first one, grief is a predictable process. It would be so much easier if that was true. If only we could know what we're going to experience and when we're going to experience it and just how long it would last. But the reality is, as we've said so many times, grief is individual. Each death occurs in a distinctive way. Sometimes it's following a long and lingering illness. Sometimes it's sudden, unexpected, and maybe even traumatic. We all got our own histories and our own relationships. And so your grief is as unique as you are. There are some patterns in how grief unfolds, but every one of us will respond in a different way to different losses. Grief doesn't follow a predictable set of stages. Myth number 2, there's a timetable to grief. And perhaps believing that there is a timetable is an attempt to make the unpredictable predictable. And it's a common myth that given a certain amount of time, maybe a year at most, we should get over it. The reality, there really is no timetable to grief. It winds its way through your life. At the beginning of the journey, we might be in shock, and it may not be the most difficult time. It can happen that in the very early stages, there's a lot to do to arrange a funeral, documentation, finances, all that kind of stuff. The busyness can protect us from the rawness of grief. And Professor Doka describes how in this early time, it's likely the friends and family are close by to, and it's a lovely way he says this, to offer us a blanket of care that covers and comforts us. But he says it's later that many people experience a deep plunge after the sense of shock begins to recede. Sometimes the support that's been around us fades. People go back into their normal lives, back to work, whatever. And then we realize that we may feel alone in our grief. There'll be ups and downs, good days and bad days, anniversaries, birthdays, other significant events, all prompt us and remind us of our sense of loss. So what we need to remember is there is no should in grieving. There is no predictable timetable. Even years later, when the intensity is diminished, we may feel surges of grief at certain times. I can illustrate this with a story from my own family. My parents lost 2 children in infancy, and this was before I was born. And I can remember my father, even 40 years after, would have a tear in his eye when he heard a certain song that reminded him of the beloved little girl who died at age 2. It was a wistful tear, a sigh, and a smile as he remembered her with love. And so these surges of grief, they can overwhelm us, but they can be balanced out by this sort of peaceful feeling of remembering good things. Myth number 3, grief is about letting go. He describes this myth as particularly destructive, and he says that letting go just doesn't work for us. Lots of the clients he meets in his counselling practice are afraid to ease their pain because they think that if they ease their pain, it would be at the cost of losing their memories, fading of their memories. They'd rather keep the pain than forget the person. And he reassures them, and is a reassurance to all of us, that as the pain ebbs, we actually do have greater access to our memories. So the reality is that we maintain a continuing bond with those that we love. Rather than cutting bonds with those who've died, we maintain a continuing bond with anyone we love, and this bond is expressed in many ways. One of the tasks of mourning is to decide how we carry our memories and how we carry our memories and feelings with us in ways that still allow us to re-engage in life. As Catholics, we believe, as in the words of the funeral service, life is changed, not ended. And so we have many ways of continuing that bond in our spiritual practices and our beliefs. We'll talk about that again later. Again, if I give an example from my own family, I grew up knowing that 2 little children had died. I knew their names. I knew their personalities because my parents told stories about them. It always felt to me that they were part of our family, even though I didn't meet them. My parents maintained their continuing bond in this way, and they shared that gift with me too. This was also in the post-war years, so maybe my parents were not typical of people at their time. Although the continuing bond was expressed in such a healthy way in our small family unit, my mother struggled often with how other people, even including extended family, wouldn't ever mention the losses or mention the names, either because they didn't know what to say or they were afraid of causing too much upset. And my mother experienced the literal walking to the other side of the road when people would see her approaching. And I can't begin to imagine how that must have felt. But in those days, there was no bereavement counselling and support as there is today, and people hadn't really got this understanding of grief and how it presents in our lives. And so the reality is there never can be closure. Sorry, I've skipped something there, haven't I? Myth number 4, after a loss we need closure. And he says this is built around 2 already discredited myths, that grief has a timetable and that we can somehow move beyond our grief by letting go and detaching from the person we loved. And he says the reality is that there never can be closure. Most people find that over time the pain becomes less and they're able to function, perhaps reasonably well. But as we've already touched on, over time we may have these surges of grief, times when we deeply feel our loss. It's not like an illness that we're going to recover from. It's not an event on the way to a destination. It involves a lifelong journey, and it includes significant moments. And rituals and memorials can help us. The funeral service can be very comforting and strengthening, and it can give us ways to express our thoughts and feelings. It's a meaningful step on the journey. At the beginning, it might feel as if grief completely fills us. Over time, the grief doesn't diminish, but life builds around it. And a while ago, I was listening to a TED talk, TED talk. I don't know if you're familiar with TED Talks. You can get them on YouTube. And this was given in 2018 by a young woman who was called Nora McInerney. Her husband, Aaron, had died at a young age, leaving her a widow with a young child. She founded a young widows group, and they used to get together and talk about their feelings and their experiences and their losses. And in one session, they decided to look at which phrases, which words that people said to them made them feel the most disturbed or even angry. The clear winner was the phrase, moving on. By now, Nora had remarried. She was in a happy, blended family. And what she said was, in the life that I live now, Aaron is still very much present for me. I have never moved on from him. Rather, I have moved forward with him. Myth number 5, we need to process the loss in order to reach resolution. Freud believed a century ago that when we experience loss, we expect to experience some form of distress, and therefore, not showing distress meant that we were denying or repressing our loss. And there's a lot of self-help literature that also assumes that people who openly express their emotions and publicly show their grief are healthier than those who don't. This is a mistaken assumption, and it can influence people who are doing okay with their grief work and perhaps cause them to begin to wonder if there's something wrong with them. And the problem, Professor Doka says, with this myth is that it sets up one way to grieve, one single roadmap. And that implies that if we're not following that roadmap, there's something wrong with us. The reality, we each process loss in our own way. We can't say that too many times. For some of us, it's a long and emotionally challenging task, and others might deal with grief more quickly and with less inner turmoil. So there are what are called styles of grieving. The emotional style of grieving is called the intuitive pattern of grieving. People cope with their grief by expressing and exploring their emotions. And most often, for most people, grief is experienced in this way. Sadness and tears are certainly not the only manifestation. There's a whole range of emotions: sadness, anger, yearning, guilt, gratitude, relief, just to name a few. An instrumental pattern of grief is experienced more physically. It can be felt like a restlessness or a bodily pain. And when we grieve instrumentally, we do or we think our pain. And perhaps the best way to illustrate these is with stories from Professor Doka's clients. So his client, who he named Sarah, came to him after her mother died. She cared for her mother through 5 years of illness and dementia. And she judged herself really harshly because she didn't cry at her mother's funeral. She felt ashamed of the relief she felt, that the suffering was over now for both herself and her mother. Eventually, Sarah was able to come to the understanding that the feelings of relief and guilt that she shared with the therapist were, in fact, how grief was manifesting for her. So Sarah was what he would call an intuitive griever. She explored and expressed her feelings of relief and guilt. Then he tells Antonio's story. Antonio was an instrumental griever, which means that his way was more physical, more to do with thoughts and actions and behaviors. Antonio's son, who was a police officer, was killed in the line of duty. Antonio organized an annual run to raise money to support grieving families of police officers. And Professor Doka tells us that Antonio was relieved when he learned that this was the component of his grief reaction. And it helped Antonio to be able to understand that he was grieving in a very active way. Many people can react to grief in a blended way. It's both instrumental and intuitive. Then the next myth is that human beings are naturally resilient to loss. Many people are resilient in experiencing loss, and many people find it very difficult. Those who are dealing with multiple losses or don't have a strong support system may need extra help as they navigate their grief journey. Some people may say that they are doing better than they think they should be doing. And this for them is a bit of a problem. You know, I should be different. I should be feeling different. The fact is that some people have a resilient reaction to grief. They may be people who have experienced fewer losses in their lives, and those losses have not been close together, one following the other. The death wasn't sudden. There was time to prepare and to say goodbye. When I reflect on my own personal experiences of loss, I'd say that our grief in our grief experience, we're not one type of griever or another, but our grief processes for some losses can follow different patterns. So we can be resilient in one situation of loss, and then in another different kind of loss, we can either be intuitive or instrumental in our grieving, or we can be a blend of both. Maybe sometimes early on might be a much more active thing. You feel that restlessness, you're pacing up and down, you need to do things. And then later on, there's the opportunity to explore the emotional side of it. That's number 7. It's easier to accept a death after a prolonged illness. We'll be looking at anticipatory grief in the next section. But he says what underlies this myth is a misunderstanding of what anticipatory grief is. And the assumption that if we've grieved in anticipation of a loss, there's less shock and we will have already completed some of the grief work. But the reality is that all deaths are difficult. Prolonged loss and sudden loss create different issues. After a sudden loss, there could be a sense of trauma and a profound sense of shock. Julia Samuel calls this experience after a sudden death grief with the volume turned up. We'll look a bit more in detail at prolonged loss and anticipatory grief after the break. As we bring this part of the session to a close, we can sum it up by understanding that we each have our own unique pattern to grieving, and there are things about the process that we share with others. There's an Asian proverb, everyone is like all others, some others, and no other. So what Professor Doka says is, like all others, we grieve when we experience loss. Like some others, your grief may follow certain process, certain pathway, certain style. But your grief is like no other. It's as unique as your fingerprints. So how do we cope? What do we do? How do we make our way through this unique journey? And when we're coping with grief, there are two things that are happening at the same time. We've got to cope with loss, mourn the loss, but at the same time, we've got to try and learn to live now in the face of the loss. And so we're in between what grief experts call loss orientation and restoration orientation. And it's important for us to allow both of these things to unfold. Spending time with our grief and allowing it to take its course, but also taking time out, time off from the exhausting work of grief. Just before we finish, I'd like to share with you something that I read recently. It really struck me, really resonated for me, because our grief journey is woven into and around our faith journey. And the quote comes from James Finley. He's a contributor to Franciscan Father Richard Rohr's daily meditation. And James Finley, as a young man, he was in a monastery where his spiritual director was Thomas Merton. And James Finley speaks of what he calls paradoxical wisdom. And it's this: they come to understand God as a presence that protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things. This is the mystery of the cross that reveals, whatever it means, that God watches over us. It doesn't mean that God prevents the tragic thing, the cruel thing, the unfair thing from happening. Rather, it means that God is intimately hidden as a kind of profound, tender sweetness that flows and carries us along in the intimate depths of the tragic thing itself, and will continue to do so in every moment of our lives, up to and through death and beyond. Such beautiful words, aren't they? God is intimately hidden as a kind of tender, profound, tender sweetness that flows and carries us along. When we're in the midst of our struggles and our experience of loss and grief, we may not have any conscious awareness of this tender sweetness. And it may be in time to come as we look back, in months or even years to come as we look back, we can get that sense that we were in fact held and carried through our journey. And it's like the footsteps poem, isn't it? When you look back and there's only one set of footprints, that's when the Lord has carried us. So if we can finish there for now, we'll have a break for, I think, about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and take a look at other kinds of grief. Thanks.
Come be with me, all you carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. I
Welcome back. In this part of the session, we're going to share some thoughts on what are termed anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief. I'll explain what each of those terms means. And then, just to finish off, we will conclude with some thoughts about loss and grief as we view them through the lens of our Catholic faith. So, anticipatory grief. We fear the news that someone we love is dying. It could be a diagnosis of terminal cancer or some other terminal health condition, or it could be the long-haul conditions of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Walking with our loved ones through the dying process is full of uncertainty and grief and challenges. We have to face the difficult time between diagnosis and death, and it's then that we can experience what's called anticipatory grief or ambiguous grief. Forms of grieving that we may not recognize as grief, and they may not be recognized by family and friends and people around us. Anticipatory grief is the grieving that happens before a death or any other significant loss. Typically, it happens when a loved one is diagnosed with a terminal or life-limiting illness like cancer, dementia, or some other chronic disease. Anticipatory grief can start a long time before someone dies. And according to the Marie Curie Foundation, this is often not acknowledged, not talked about, not even understood. But it is completely normal to begin grieving before someone dies. When a person receives a terminal diagnosis, when a loved one has that diagnosis, grief can begin right there and then. And the feelings that are experienced can be just as intense and difficult as the feelings that we have after someone has died. Anticipatory grief doesn't necessarily replace, reduce, or make grief after loss any easier or shorter. But for some people, it can provide an opportunity to prepare for the loss and to prepare for what the future might look like. So what does anticipatory grief feel like? It involves many losses. Some days can be really hard. Other days you may not even feel that you're experiencing any grief feelings. And of course, as we keep on saying, we all grieve differently. There's no right or wrong way to feel. And it's important to remember that all your feelings are valid. Whatever you're feeling, all your feelings are valid. Information gathered from Sue Ryder Foundation and Cruise Bereavement Care I'll share with you now in terms of, how does this feel? You can also access these resources yourself to sort of get a further understanding. But what they do is list some of the common feelings that we might have. When you're caring for someone who's dying, you may feel anxious. Sadness and painful feelings can come on very suddenly. It can feel as if it's hitting you for the first time, over and over again. And it's very normal to feel frightened about how you'll cope and what will happen next. You may feel very angry with the situation, or even with your loved one for leaving you. And you might also have to cope with their anger and their grief. The illness may have changed the person you're caring for, and you might feel that others don't understand what you're going through. Your opportunities to go out and meet people might be limited, and so you might end up feeling lonely or isolated. And of course, caring duties and worry can be very exhausting. Some people find themselves anticipating and picturing what will it be like after their loved one dies. And they can feel guilty about having these thoughts. But these kinds of thoughts are normal. It's part of the process of preparing yourself for what will come. And of course, you may also have uh, physical things that are happening, difficulty in concentrating, difficulty in sleeping, digestive upsets. All of these are very common. So how can you support yourself at this difficult time? I've listed some of the suggestions from Cru's bereavement support, and it's by no means an exhaustive list. But what is important if you're in this situation is that you support yourself as best you can and in ways that are helpful to you. Allow yourself to grieve. It is important to express your pain and to allow yourself the time and space to grieve. It might help to talk to a family member or to a friend and try not to hide your emotions. And remember that others might be feeling the same as you are. It's just that nobody's talking about it. The bereavement support team here will always be available if you need to talk to someone, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Some people find it helpful to write down thoughts and feelings in a journal. Not everybody feels that they can do this. If you can, if it's something that is, feels natural to you, sometimes it's actually easier to write than to say how you're feeling. No one else needs to see or read your journal. You can even put it away and not look at it again, or you might want to, in time to come, perhaps, how did I get through that? What was I feeling? Helps some people. Very important to look for support. There are lots of ways you can do it. If you have access to the internet and feel comfortable using the internet, there are some online forums and support groups. Lots of organizations offer information and support. There's Marie Curie, Sue Ryder Foundation, Cru's, and more. And on a local level, the Carer Centre in Swansea, it's a specialist voluntary organisation that provides support and information to carers in a wide variety of ways. They help with all kinds of things, form filling, practical stuff. And then of course, again, there will be support for you here in the parish. Sometimes people feel a bit more in control of the situation when they can learn more about the condition, the treatments, the side effects, and the prognosis. And then take care of yourself. Taking care of yourself and your own needs may sound easier said than done, but if you possibly can get some rest, take some time out, eat well, try to get some exercise, it can help to keep you going and to cope with your ongoing situation. Be kind to yourself. When you have a lot to deal with, try to be realistic about how much you can do, both practically and emotionally, and ask for help when you need it. And then finally, take it a day at a time. If you can focus on the day in hand rather than worrying ahead of time, that can help. And of course, our faith can be a significant source of support for us in difficult times. Many times I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard as well, people in these kind of situations, I don't know how I would cope with this if not for my faith. Perhaps our prayer time becomes a priority for us during this time, or perhaps as the caring responsibilities increase, we're not only busy but distracted, can't concentrate. We might find it more difficult to have the presence of mind and the interior space that we feel we need. Fairly recently, Franciscan Father Richard Rohr in his daily meditation said this: "Everything we do in conscious union and in love is prayer." I think this feels very comforting, doesn't it, to know that as we go through our day, caring for our loved ones, this too can be our prayer when we do it in conscious union with the God who loves us. I'd also like to share again, I shared this last year, I did intend to bring some copies. I will get some copies if you want them. And it's a prayer that was said by Catholic nurses in the 1940s when they prayed for strength to tend those that have been entrusted to their care. O Angel of Gethsemane, chosen by the Father to bring strength and consolation to Jesus during his agony, I ask you to be with me now as I keep watch over my loved one who is sick and suffering. Help me to offer my best care, love and protection to this child of God. May my words and my touch be filled with gentleness. My presence bring comfort, and my prayers bring rest and healing sleep. Do what I cannot do, O loving angel, to bring healing and strength to soul and body according to the Father's will. Such a beautiful prayer, I think. We're told in Luke's Gospel that an angel came to strengthen Jesus during his time of agony. In our own times of stress, we might just find it enough in our hearts, in our minds to say, Angel of Gethsemane, I ask you to be with me now and to strengthen me. When our loved one is diagnosed with dementia, a lot of what we said so far about anticipatory grief will apply, but there are some particular challenges in this situation which are very difficult to come to terms with. Dementia is progressive, it will get worse over time, and it's life-shortening. According to the Alzheimer's Society, the emotions of grief are likely to be felt at different times and in different ways. At the time of diagnosis or as the dementia progresses. And Professor Doka has said that grief is the constant yet hidden companion of dementia. There are two types of grief that may be experienced following the diagnosis of dementia. There's anticipatory grief for the losses we anticipate in the future. For example, we might dread the time when our loved one no longer recognizes us. And then there's what's called ambiguous grief. Our loved one is physically present, but emotionally absent. Perhaps they can't participate in conversations like they used to, or have the same role in the family as they had before. And this can bring about a whole range of confusing and distressing emotions. And it is common to experience conflicting emotions. You may feel love and anger both at the same time. Again, just remind yourself, all of your feelings and emotions are valid. Both anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief can be difficult for others and even for yourself to recognize. And again, self-care is important. Sharing your thoughts and feelings with a trusted person can help. And advice and support are available from Alzheimer's Society, Dementia UK, and many other sources. And then again, the Carer Centre in Swansea is a really good source of information and advice and support. As we care for our loved one as their dementia progresses, sometimes we've got to look for new ways to engage with them and to spend time with them. A friend of mine who's a retired nurse cared for her husband throughout his decline with dementia, and she very kindly allowed me to share part of her story with you. He'd been a music director of a male voice choir. They both loved music. They travelled throughout the UK and to other countries where the choir gave concerts. In the later stages of her husband's dementia, at times when he's agitated and unable to settle, she would sit with him and play the videos of those concerts. They used to enjoy the music together, and after a few minutes, almost immediately, he'd smile and relax. And after a few minutes, he'd raise his hand and begin to conduct the choir. And this was a very special shared time for them. She was happy to see him being so happy and so engrossed in his music. And this was one of the ways they engaged with each other in a new way. can share a personal story as well. My mother had dementia for more than 15 years, and for 12 of those years, she hardly spoke, and she didn't know me at all. Eventually, she needed 24-hour care in a nursing home. And so I used to visit on my way home from work, and very often that coincided with meal times. I then made it a point of being there at meal times, because after a while I began to realize that sitting with my mother and feeding her had become our connection and our communication. I could sit silently, I could speak my love through my actions rather than through the words, because she didn't seem to be any longer able to understand words. That became a special shared time. That was a new way of engaging and another way of creating, maintaining meaningful relationship. What I've been able to share with you today is by no means fully comprehensive view of the complex and difficult issues that we'll encounter as we journey through grief. Whether it's the grief we experience when a loved one dies, or whether it's the anticipatory and or ambiguous grief when our loved one is diagnosed with a terminal illness or with dementia. What I hope from today is that all of us learn more about loss, grief, and bereavement, that be able to navigate our journeys and accompany others in their grief journeys with greater understanding and consequently greater compassion for ourselves and for others. That we will be able to do as Julia Samuel says we must do, understand the process of grief and acknowledge its necessity. Finally, and briefly today, we can look at how our faith helps us in our journey. I recently read a book by Marianne Williamson, Tears to Triumph, and there's one paragraph that really struck me because it seemed to make a link or a bridge between the psychology of loss and the spirituality of loss. She tells us grief is something that we need to go through, processing the mysteries of love and loss, in order to finally see that in spirit there is no loss, and that our mourning is a sacred journey, a journey that cannot and should not be rushed. Processing the mysteries of love and loss. In spirit, there is no loss. Mourning is a sacred journey. Note that she says, we finally see. And coming to the realization is part of the journey, however long that might take. And we know that God is with us, hidden in the intimate depths, as James Finley said, hidden in the intimate depths and carrying us through. Marianne Williamson also talks about how we've adapted as humans on internal and external levels. And she explains it by saying that bodies and minds have developed immune systems, and that the basis of the mind's immune system is grief. Grief allows us to process incrementally, little by little, what might be too much for the system to process all at once. And again, she says, when we're grieving, we are moving through a profound and significant experience. A sorrowful time can be a sacred time. Again, if I can give a personal reflection, I would say I came to see that there's also a sacredness to the journey made by our loved ones as they move closer towards the end of their lives. It's 16 years since my mother died, and as I mentioned earlier, she had dementia for many years. She didn't know any of her family or friends. She hardly ever spoke. When her body was received into the church the evening before her funeral, Father Cyril said something that I've never forgotten. He said, "Today we are here to greet a lady whose years of silent suffering have sanctified the world." Every time I say that, I get a kind of shiver all the way through. Never forgotten that. It's such comforting words. And in that one simple sentence, he gave dignity and, yes, a sense of sacredness and meaning to those last difficult and painful years. Richard Rohr often uses the phrase God's economy of grace. And what I hear in that phrase is no pain, no suffering, no tragic thing is ever wasted in God's economy of grace. Some of you may remember that last year I shared some thoughts from Oblate Father Ron Rolheiser's book, The Holy Longing. Father Rolheiser describes the stages of the Paschal event in our lives as the pattern of all the losses that we experience in life, the failures and disappointments. He wasn't speaking of bereavement in particular, but it's clear to see from the pattern for the process of grief as we view it through the eyes of our Christian faith. He described the process in a most beautiful way that honors our grief and gives us hope and consolation. So, Holy Week, Good Friday, the losses of our life, real death. Easter Sunday, the reception of new life. 40 days following Easter, a time for readjustment to the new and grieving the old. It's what Julia Samuel describes as the process, the movement between loss and restoration. It's what Richard Rohr would call liminal space, a threshold time, a time of waiting. Ascension is for letting go of the old and letting it bless you and the refusal to cling. And Pentecost is the reception of a new spirit for the new life that you're already living. And of course, this is a representation of phases that we go through. It's not literal in the terms of the timing. And as we've said so many times, each person will go at their own pace. I just want to look at that phrase, refusal to cling, because that kind of bothered me when I saw it first. But Jesus said to Mary Magdalene, "Don't cling to me." How can we interpret that? And it seems to me that it's not about the end of the relationship, but allowing the emergence of a changed and ongoing relationship, a new relationship in the Spirit. As Marianne Williamson said, in spirit there is no loss. Ronald Rolheiser says elsewhere in a reflection online, when Mary Magdalene went to Jesus' tomb and found it empty, she went away crying. Before she got to tell anyone, she met a resurrected Jesus who shared with her how his energy, colour, love, and person would be found in a radically new modality inside his spirit. And Father Rolheiser tells us this contains the secret of how we are to give life to our own loved ones after they've died. Of course, we're in the month of November, where the Church devotes the entire month to remembering and praying for our loved ones who've gone before us. In the Creed we say, I believe in the communion of saints. And Catherine O'Connell Cahill reminds us, when we celebrate the Eucharist, we pray with all those who have gone before us. We living can pray for the dead on their journey to God. The multitude in heaven prayed for the rest of us and remain present to us in ways that we don't know. And so we are bound in some marvelous, inexplicable way to those who've gone before us. So I'm going to finish in a few minutes with just a final word about bereavement support. Father Michael has placed a great deal of importance on raising awareness about grief, loss and bereavement, and that's why we have these talks. He also wants to make sure that the people of this parish are supported in their grief journeys. The bereavement team will make their details available to anybody who wants to look for their support. I think you've got some cards, have you? Yeah, there's some cards in the porch. But anyway, if you feel you'd like to talk to someone in confidence, to share your thoughts and feelings, or maybe just to take the opportunity to talk about your loved one, name them, talk about them to somebody who wants to listen. And it really doesn't matter if your loss was recent or some time ago, because like we said, there's no timetable in grief. Now, some of the team are here today, Um, I don't know, does everybody know who they are? They'll be made known to you anyway. And going forward, the team will check in with every person after a loved one dies, and they'll offer their support. And you can take it up as and when you feel that you need it, whether that's right away or sometime later. So I think that's all from me. If anybody has any questions, I would try to answer or point you in the right direction for an answer. Yeah.
Thanks, Donna. That was absolutely amazing. And it's so calming. But a lot of what you said resonated with me personally. What happens in a situation where you have one parent with a terminal illness, both parents with dementia and Alzheimer's, and all the increased responsibilities you have with that, and all the emotions that go with that? And then one family member who cannot take on responsibilities because they say they cannot cope with the feeling of knowing that that parent or both parents are going to pass, and also they're not able to cope with all, you know, with all the feelings that go with it as well. How do you approach that person and tell them it's okay, that's normal to feel like that, but you know, we kind of need your help as well? But like you say, you know, to try and bring them along and not say, oh well, you know, you're not being responsible, you shouldn't be feeling like that. And those things do kind of pass through your mind. But how do you approach that situation? Thank you.
It's difficult to approach situations like that, you know, without knowing the people as well. You actually said, how do I communicate to them, it's normal what you're feeling, but we need your help? That to me sounds like such a good way. You know, you can't force people into doing what they feel they can't do. Sometimes in families there's a lot of mutual protection going on. People don't want to say something in front of someone, or, you know. I remember in the early days of my mother's dementia, I don't think it had been even diagnosed at that time, it was clear it was happening. A friend of mine who was close to me and close to my parents, she just said to me, you and your dad need to talk to each other. We'd always talk to each other. No, she said, you really need to talk to each other. I thought, okay. And my dad and I had that very difficult conversation, but it kind of changed things. We didn't continue to protect each other anymore. We weren't afraid to cry in front of each other. We talked about how we were feeling, and it just kind of helped the process. But it's difficult to invite someone who doesn't, you know, who's resistant to being invited. I don't think that really answers your question, does it? But I think that's the best that I can give you. Does that help in any way? Okay.
Again, thank you so much, Donna. I think this is so needed, because they used to say that, you know, people wouldn't talk about certain things, but now the thing that nobody wants to talk about is death, you know. And I'm wondering, any advice for if you're caring for a person who is really frightened of dying? It doesn't really matter what the age is, you know, we're all going to die anyway. And how do I deal with it? You know, how can I help that person? And they are a person of faith, that, you know, I think they do believe, but death is morbid. you know, and they're really frightened. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. But that's a bit, you know, bit of a problem, really, isn't it? Because we're all going to die. So I don't know if you're able to offer any advice when we kind of come up with people who, you know, just, you know, don't want to face it, you know. And I'm just wondering, sorry, probably a really hard question.
I don't feel qualified really to give an answer to that, except to say that there are organizations that you can contact quite easily who are experts in this kind of thing. So, you know, Sue Ryder Foundation, Marie Curie, these people, you can contact them if you have access to the internet. You can contact them, and they may be able to offer you some advice, or, you know, whatever, that they are the people who are qualified really and have a full understanding of these things. So I'm sorry to say I don't feel qualified to. No. I think it's important to ask, because, you know, where do you turn? Well, that, you know, there are these organizations that can be helpful in these difficult situations. So, and they really are the people with the experience and the expertise to deal with, you know, those sort of situations. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I wanted to specifically say thank you about how you talked about your own personal experience with dementia and your mother. I think a lot of us have got experience of dealing with people, not necessarily family members, but friends, and the difficulty in how you actually relate to them when, as you say, they don't seem to be able, you don't seem to be able to reach them. And I loved your comment about how in feeding your mother, you developed that connection. I've got one little thing to share with you. I was talking to someone whose mother had developed dementia, and like a lot of people in that situation, she's got busy hands. And so what they decided to do was to make a large pillow, and on the pillow, so small rings with photographs of all the family members on there, so that while she was fiddling around with these things, she was fiddling around and looking at photographs of children, grandchildren, etc. And they felt that then they could talk to her and say, well, do you remember that? That was when we were on holiday, and that's your grandchild, and that was a way of making a connection. But as always, your talks are wonderful. They're both inspiring and very helpful. So thank you very much.
I used to belong to a knitting group. COVID stopped us, but one of the things that we used to make were called twiddle muffs, and it's along the lines of what Eileen just said. You know, it'd be like a muff, and all sorts. So you can add anything you want to it, and it's something to do for those busy, restless hands. And yeah, you can use it use your imagination. You can use them any way, and they're very easy to do. You know, if you know anything about knitting, very easy to do. Just a complete aside there. Shall we close? Oh, thank you. Shall we close with a prayer then? Glory be to him whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Glory be to him from generation to generation, in the church and in Christ Jesus, forever and ever. Amen. And as we remember our loved ones who have gone before us, let's pray. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. Amen. Thank you.